The first night, it was just the sound of twigs snapping in the distance. By the second night, I realized it wasn't an animal, it was footsteps. I'm Daniel, a 29-year-old, a consultant who's probably spent more time staring at a computer screen than most people spend sleeping. I live alone in a small apartment in Indianapolis. Life had started to feel monotonous: work, eat, sleep, repeat. So, when my college friend Cian suggested I go on a solo camping trip to clear my head, I reluctantly agreed. Cian was always the outdoorsy type, the guy who spent weekends climbing mountains or kayaking through rivers while I stayed home troubleshooting network issues, but he had a point. I needed a break. I decided to head out to Hoosier National Forest. It was just a 2-hour drive from home, and I'd heard it had some great trails. Cian lent me his camping gear, gave me a quick rundown on survival basics, and sent me off with a smirk and a "don't get eaten by a bear." Looking back, I wish it had been a bear. I arrived at the forest just after noon. The air was cool, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy of leaves, casting dappled shadows on the trail. It felt good to be outside for once, away from the hum of servers and the glare of fluorescent lights. The hike to my campsite took about 3 hours. I chose a spot near a small creek surrounded by towering oaks and maples. It was secluded, just what I needed. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and started a small fire. By the time I finished dinner, a can of chili heated over the flames. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the forest was bathed in twilight. That first night was uneventful. I sat by the fire, listening to the sounds of the woods, the chirping of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the babbling of the creek. It was peaceful, almost therapeutic. The second day started off well enough. I spent the morning exploring the area, snapping a few photos with my phone, and jotting down notes in a journal Cian had insisted I bring. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something odd: a set of footprints in the soft dirt near the creek, barefoot, human footprints. At first, I thought they might be mine from the day before, but when I compared them to my boot prints, it was clear they didn't match. These were smaller, like a child's. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone else had passed through here recently. The forest wasn't completely deserted after all. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That evening, as the sun dipped low, I built another fire and cooked dinner. But this time, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just beyond the firelight. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I told myself to stop being paranoid. And then I heard it, a twig snapping somewhere in the dark. I froze, straining to listen. Another snap, closer this time. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. Silence. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just an animal, a deer, maybe. I drifted off to sleep eventually, though it was a restless, uneasy sleep. The next morning, I found something outside my tent. A small pile of rocks, stacked neatly in a pyramid shape. I stared at it, my stomach twisting into knots. It wasn't there the night before. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe I'd done it myself without realizing it, or maybe it was just some kind of weird coincidence. I spent the day hiking farther into the woods, trying to distract myself. The scenery was beautiful, but I couldn't enjoy it. My mind kept drifting back to the rocks, the footprints, the noises in the night. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was setting. My firewood pile was scattered across the ground, as if someone had kicked it over. "Okay," I muttered to myself, heart racing. "It's probably just some prankster." I rebuilt the fire, trying to push down the rising panic. But that night, as I sat by the flames, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The sounds started again, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. This time, it was closer. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the trees. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a pale face, just at the edge of the light. I stumbled backward, the flashlight shaking in my hand. When I looked again, it was gone. By morning, I had made up my mind to leave. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The woods felt different now, darker, quieter. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I told myself I was being ridiculous. The footprints, the rocks, the noises there had to be a logical explanation. By the time I reached my car, I almost believed it. The sight of the dusty blue sedan sitting in the parking lot was like a lifeline. I threw my pack into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I let out a shaky laugh. I was safe, or so I thought. About 15 minutes into the drive, I noticed something odd. A figure standing at the edge of the road, just barely visible in the rearview mirror. It was pale and motionless, its face obscured by shadows. My stomach dropped. I pressed harder on the gas, heart pounding. But the feeling didn't go away. The farther I drove, the stronger it got, the sense that I was being followed. When I reached the main highway, I finally started to calm down. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was safe now. But as I pulled into my apartment complex, I saw them. Footprints. A trail of barefoot, human footprints leading from the parking lot to my front door. That was 3 days ago. I haven't left my apartment since. At night, I hear things, soft whispers, the sound of bare feet on hardwood floors. This morning, I found another pile of rocks on my kitchen counter. I don't know what it wants, but I'm terrified to find out. And I can't stop thinking about what Scene said before I left. Don't get eaten by a bear. A bear would have been better. I've always been the kind of person who loves the outdoors. Growing up in a small town in Montana, I was practically raised in the woods. Every summer, my friends and I would pack up our gear, head to some secluded spot, and spend a weekend fishing, hiking, and laughing around a campfire. It was our thing, a tradition we'd kept alive well into our 20s. This year, it was my idea to try something different, someplace none of us had been before. I'd found a spot online, deep in a remote forest about 2 hours from town. The reviews were glowing, perfect for stargazing, so quiet you can hear your thoughts. That sounded like paradise to me. We were a group of 4. Me, my best friend Caleb, his girlfriend Sarah, and Eric, a guy I'd known since high school. We loaded up my truck early on a Friday morning, crammed it with supplies, and set off. Spirits were high, music was blasting, and the cooler was full of beer. The first sign that something was off came when we turned onto the final dirt road leading to the campsite. It wasn't marked, which I thought was odd, but it wasn't uncommon for remote spots. The road itself was narrow and overgrown, with branches scraping against the truck as we pushed through. "What kind of place is this, man?" Caleb asked, leaning forward from the back seat. "Trust me," I said. "It's supposed to be worth it." And at first it was. We arrived at a clearing surrounded by tall pines, with a small lake shimmering in the sunlight. It looked exactly like the photos I'd seen online. We set up our tents, built a fire pit, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. The air was fresh, the water was cold, and we didn't see another soul for miles. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere began to shift. It started with the noises, small, almost imperceptible at first. While we were sitting around the fire, I thought I heard something in the woods behind me. A rustling, like someone or something moving through the underbrush. "You hear that?" I asked. "Hear what?" Sarah replied, poking at the fire with a stick. "I don't know. Probably an animal." I tried to laugh it off, but it left me feeling uneasy. As the night went on, the noises became harder to ignore. There were footsteps, soft but deliberate, circling the perimeter of our camp. Caleb joked that it was Bigfoot, but I wasn't laughing. "Could just be a deer," Eric suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. We all turned in for the night around midnight, but I couldn't sleep. I lay in my tent, staring at the nylon ceiling, listening to the forest. The footsteps came back, closer this time, stopping just outside my tent. "Hello?" I whispered. Silence. I told myself it was nothing, just an overactive imagination, and eventually drifted off. The next morning, things got weirder. Eric's tent was unzipped when we woke up, even though he swore he'd closed it before bed. His sleeping bag was damp, like it had been dragged outside. "Maybe you got up to pee and forgot," Sarah said. "I didn't," Eric replied, his face pale. We brushed it off, but there was an unspoken tension between us for the rest of the day. The forest felt different now, less inviting. The shadows seemed darker, the silence heavier. That evening, as we sat around the fire again, Sarah noticed something. "Guys, where's the cooler?" It had been right next to the truck, but it was gone. We searched the campsite, even checked the edge of the woods, but it had vanished. "Maybe a bear took it," Caleb said, though there were no tracks. "Bears don't carry coolers into the woods," I muttered. That night, the noises returned, louder, closer, more distinct. They weren't just footsteps anymore. There were whispers too, faint but unmistakable. Leave. The breaking point came on the third night. By then, none of us were sleeping well. The unease had morphed into outright fear, though none of us wanted to admit it. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to Caleb shaking me. "Dude, wake up," he hissed. "What? What's wrong?" "It's Sarah. She's gone." I scrambled out of my tent and found Eric already outside, holding a flashlight. "She's probably just in the woods," I said, trying to stay calm. "Let's look for her." We called her name, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no response. Then we heard it, a faint cry for help, coming from deeper in the forest. "That's her," Caleb shouted, running toward the sound. "Wait!" I yelled, but he was already gone. Eric and I chased after him, the beam of his flashlight bouncing wildly. The cry came again, closer this time, but it didn't sound quite right. It was distorted, like someone mimicking Sarah's voice. "Caleb, stop!" I shouted. He didn't listen. We found him standing in a small clearing, his flashlight shining on something that made my stomach drop. It was the cooler. It was sitting upright in the middle of the clearing, its lid slightly open. "That's weird," Eric said, his voice trembling. Caleb walked toward it, reaching out to lift the lid. "Don't," I said, but it was too late. The moment he opened it, the whispers erupted around us, louder and more chaotic than ever. They came from everywhere, from the trees, the ground, the air itself. "Leave, leave, leave." We ran. We didn't stop until we were back at the truck, panting and drenched in sweat. Caleb was shaking, his face pale. "Where's Sarah?" he whispered. We didn't have an answer. At dawn, we packed up and left, abandoning most of our gear. Caleb filed a missing persons report when we got back, but the search turned up nothing. Sarah was gone, just like the whispers, just like the cooler. It's been 3 years since that trip, and I still don't know what happened. Caleb and I don't talk much anymore, and Eric moved to another state. I haven't been camping since. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear those whispers again, faint and distant, calling me back to the woods. I don't think I'll ever go. The first sign that something was wrong came at dawn when I unzipped my tent and found footprints circling my campsite. They weren't mine. I'm Nate Dawson, 33, single, and, according to my mom, hopelessly allergic to stability. I work remotely as a graphic designer, which gives me the freedom to pack up and disappear whenever I feel like it. I've spent the last couple of years jumping between road trips, cheap motels, and campsites. It's not glamorous, but it suits me. Last month, after finishing a big project, I decided to take a solo camping trip to clear my head. I chose a spot deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, far from cell service and civilization. I've camped alone plenty of times, and I've always found it peaceful. But this time was different. I got to the trailhead around noon. My pack was heavy with supplies, and the air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine. It was the kind of day that made you feel alive. The hike to my chosen spot was about 5 miles, mostly uphill. I passed one older couple heading back to their car, but otherwise, the trail was empty. That's what I wanted, complete isolation. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was sinking low. The spot was perfect, a flat patch of grass surrounded by trees, with a small stream trickling nearby. I set up my tent, started a fire, and cooked dinner. As the stars came out, I leaned back against a log, sipping coffee from my thermos. It was so quiet out there. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of leaves or hoot of an owl. I should have felt at peace, but for some reason, I didn't. The first night passed without incident, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept hearing faint noises, branches snapping, leaves crunching, but whenever I shone my flashlight into the trees, there was nothing there. The next morning, I found the footprints. They were all around my campsite, pressed into the damp earth, barefoot, human footprints circling my tent in a loose, uneven pattern. I stared at them for a long time, my heart pounding. They were too big to be a child's, but smaller than mine. "Probably just some weirdo messing around," I muttered to myself, trying to sound confident, but my voice wavered. I spent the day hiking to a nearby overlook. The view was incredible, rolling hills stretching for miles, bathed in autumn colors. For a while, I managed to forget about the footprints. When I got back to camp that evening, everything seemed normal. My tent was untouched, and there were no new footprints. I convinced myself it had just been a one-time thing. I was wrong. That night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, a soft murmur, like two people having a conversation just out of earshot. I froze, holding my breath. My tent felt suffocatingly small, the darkness pressing in from all sides. The whispering stopped. Then I heard it, a low, guttural laugh coming from somewhere outside the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent as quickly as I could, shining the beam into the trees. Nothing, just the wind rustling the branches. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. Silence. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I decided to pack up and leave. I told myself I was being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I was loading my pack, I noticed something on the ground near the fire pit, a small carved figure made of twigs and twine. It looked like a crude little doll with a head and stick arms. My stomach turned. I tossed it into the fire without a second thought. It burned quickly, the twine curling into ash. I should have felt better, but I didn't. The woods felt different now, heavier, like the air was charged with something unseen. Still, I told myself I was overreacting. By midday, I was back on the trail heading toward my car. The hike back felt longer than it should have. The forest was eerily quiet, no birds or insects, just the crunch of my boots on the trail. About halfway to the trailhead, I noticed something odd. The trees seemed wrong. Their trunks were twisted, gnarled in ways I hadn't noticed before. And then I saw the first doll. It was hanging from a low branch, swaying gently in the breeze, made of sticks and twine, just like the one I'd burned. I stared at it, my heart hammering. Then I saw another and another. They were everywhere, dangling from the trees like grotesque ornaments. I started walking faster, almost jogging, my pack bouncing against my back. The trail felt endless, the trees closing in around me. I heard it again, the whispering. Louder this time, coming from all directions. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. No response, just that low murmur, rising and falling like the wind. And then the laughter started. I ran. I don't know how far or how long, but I ran until my legs felt like they would give out. The whispers and laughter followed me, growing louder, closer. The trail disappeared. I didn't notice at first, too focused on the sound of my own ragged breathing. But when I stopped to catch my breath, I realized I was no longer on the path. The forest was darker now, the trees so dense they blotted out the sun. My flashlight flickered, the beam weak and sputtering. "Help," I whispered, though I knew no one could hear me. The laughter stopped. For a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then, I heard it, a new sound, soft and deliberate. Footsteps. They were coming toward me, slow and steady, crunching through the leaves. I shone my flashlight in the direction of the noise. The beam caught a figure, just for a second, a pale face, too thin, with eyes like black holes. I screamed and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, my flashlight swinging wildly. The footsteps followed, faster now, almost running. I don't remember how I found the trail again. All I know is that I saw the parking lot ahead, my car sitting there like a beacon of salvation. I threw my pack into the back seat and tore out of there, gravel spraying under my tires. It's been a week since that trip, and I haven't been able to sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the whispers, the laughter. Yesterday, I found something on my doorstep. A small carved figure made of sticks and twine. I don't know what it wants, but I'm afraid I brought it with me. And I'm afraid it's not finished with me yet. I used to love camping. There's something about the simplicity of it, being away from the buzz of the city. No cell service, just you and the wild. I used to think it was the best way to recharge. Now, the thought of sleeping under the stars makes my skin crawl. It started with an impulse trip, one of those last-minute decisions fueled by a long week and a need for escape. I had just turned 29, stuck in a job that felt more like a sentence, and the walls of my one-bedroom apartment were closing in on me. The idea of a weekend alone in the woods sounded like exactly what I needed. I decided on a spot about 4 hours out of town, Tall Pines National Forest. It wasn't a well-known campground, but that was the appeal. A quiet, out-of-the-way spot where I could hike, build a fire, and maybe finally finish the novel that had been collecting dust on my nightstand. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, a cooler with enough food for 2 days, and a flashlight I realized later had dying batteries. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already sinking, painting the trees in deep oranges and purple. I parked my car at the small gravel lot, shouldered my backpack, and started the mile-long trek to the clearing I'd found on a map. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that nipped at your ears but wasn't unpleasant. The trail was quiet except for the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. About halfway to the clearing, I noticed something strange. The forest had grown eerily still. No birdsong, no rustle of animals in the underbrush, just silence. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to the late hour. By the time I reached the clearing, it was almost dark. I set up my tent quickly, built a small fire, and settled in for the night. The woods seemed less menacing under the warm glow of the fire, and I found myself relaxing, enjoying the solitude. Around midnight, I woke to a sound. It was subtle at first, a faint rustling outside the tent. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It could have been anything: a raccoon, a deer, but in the dead of night, with nothing but thin fabric between you and the unknown. Every noise feels sinister. I reached for the flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it through the tent wall. Nothing, just the faint glow of the dying fire outside. Probably the wind, I whispered to myself, though there wasn't a breeze. I lay back down, listening. The rustling stopped, and after a while, I drifted off. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt near my tent. They weren't animal tracks, though they were boot prints. Human. A chill ran down my spine as I knelt to inspect them. They circled my tent, deliberate and slow, like someone had been pacing around it. Maybe another camper, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. But I knew it wasn't true. The trail I'd taken wasn't marked, and the clearing wasn't on any official maps. I spent the day hiking, trying to shake the unease. The forest felt different in the daylight, less oppressive. I even managed to enjoy myself for a while, snapping photos and losing myself in the rhythm of the trail. By the time I returned to camp, I'd almost convinced myself I was overreacting. That night, I built the fire higher, adding extra wood until the flames roared. It felt safer somehow. I sat close to it, eating my dinner and staring into the flames. The night was quiet again, unnaturally so. Around 10 p.m., the noises started. At first, it was faint, a soft crunching, like footsteps in the distance. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. Someone was walking through the woods toward my camp. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. I stood, gripping the flashlight in one hand and a heavy branch from the fire in the other. "If someone's out there, you're freaking me out. Just come out and say something." Nothing. I scanned the tree line with the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist, playing tricks on my eyes. Then, just at the edge of the light, I saw movement, a figure darting behind a tree. "Hey!" I shouted, my heart hammering in my chest. No response. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, the branch still in my hand, watching the woods. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave. Whatever relaxation I'd been hoping for was gone, replaced by a gnawing dread. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. The hike back to the car felt longer than I remembered. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set me on edge. By the time I reached the gravel lot, I was sweating despite the cool air. The relief I felt when I saw my car was short-lived. There were scratches down the driver's side, long and jagged, like someone had dragged a blade across the metal. A folded piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it. "You're not alone." I threw my gear into the car and sped out of there, gravel kicking up behind me. That should have been the end of it. I should have been able to chalk it up to some sick prank and move on. But the nightmare started a week later. I'd dream of the forest, of being trapped in my tent, hearing those footsteps circling closer and closer. I'd dream of the figure at the edge of the light, of eyes watching me through the trees. Sometimes I wake up and swear I hear footsteps outside my window. The scratches on my car haven't faded, and no amount of washing gets rid of the faint smell of smoke that clings to it. I haven't been camping since,